Welcome to Filed, a monthly conversation with those at the convergence of data privacy, data security, data regulation, records and governance. I'm Kris Brown, co-host here at Filed, and Anthony Woodward, the CEO of RecordPoint, isn't joining me today, so we're going to fly solo, but I'm very excited about the guests we're going to have. While we normally float around high-level issues such as data privacy or AI, this week we wanted to get a little bit more specific and focus on something every business needs to work hard on: understanding their unstructured data. And for that, well, I couldn't think of anyone better to help me with this topic, and that's RecordPoint's very own head of product, Joe Pearce. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Kris. It's really great to be here.
Look, Joe, it's great to have you on the podcast. And for the listener, I'd love it if you could just share a little bit about yourself and the history before you came to RecordPoint.
Yeah, happy to. So I've got about 2 decades building out enterprise SaaS in the field, at first in the insurtech world. And then most relevant to the path that led me to RecordPoint, I spent about a decade creating security, compliance, and privacy software. It was living in this world where I used to be blown away by just how few people had any clue where their regulated data was before we would go out there and start to work with them. And so, getting into topics like the ones that we're talking about today with unstructured data, like this is the sort of stuff that is now completely possible to get a handle on these things. And I'm super excited to kind of dig into this world and make it a little less scary for folks effectively.
And of course, you joined RecordPoint because I'm here, Joe. That's what you were supposed to say there. But anyway, that's fine.
Look, you had a great pitch. I'll give you that.
No, excellent. And look, I'm super excited to chat with you today. So this week, we're going to be talking about the risks that come with unstructured data, which is perhaps a little less newsy than our usual topics, but one I would imagine affects every single one of our listeners. And so, look, can you briefly go over, what is unstructured data and why is it problematic?
Happy to. Best way to understand what unstructured data is to compare it to its counterpart in structured data. You can think of structured data as stuff that's in a database, right? Or some application where you're using a database. So this is data that has well-defined structure. Like this field is going to be a number. It can't be longer than this length. That sort of stuff is structured data. So imagine that you're using really most of your SaaS applications. You're using Salesforce. You're entering a new lead into Salesforce. You're creating structured data in the back end there. You can also think of this a lot of the times as stuff the engineers do or the data scientists do, because they really love structured data for these sorts of situations. Unstructured data, it's basically everything else. It's the Word documents, it's the images, it's the emails. I was at a privacy conference a few months ago. I ran across several people that were doing drones and autonomous cars, and they're talking about trying to regulate and get governance on top of biometric data, which is another form of unstructured data. So you and I, kind of the big difference is, it doesn't take the engineers to create unstructured data. You and I have all the tools that we need to create it today in our email applications or generating images on Midjourney and things like that. And, this, just because of the human element, it's very inconsistent. It's very unpredictable. If you could predict human actions, then you'd have a huge superpower out there. And we could put whatever we want into an email. Unstructured data is interesting too, because it's difficult to search for. So if I had a million rows of structured database, a SQL or an Oracle database, or even a semi-structured database like MongoDB, if I wanted to search through that data of a million rows, I could do it with a query. I mean, we're talking like milliseconds to return this data. But if I had a million unstructured files, some are Word, some are Excel, some are videos, some is source code, and I want to search for certain data inside of that, it's really hard. And this is why for so long, folks were really just kind of sticking their head in the sand and ignoring it, and particularly from the privacy and security point of view.
The average worker is actually generating a lot more unstructured data. That office worker is generating a lot more Word documents and emails, and perhaps they are generating Salesforce entries or working directly in a database. That's not to say that they're not generating lots of structured data, but that generally I spend a lot of my time in unstructured data sources, creating Word documents, contracts, other reviews, and obviously responding to RFPs, talking to partners, these sorts of things. It is actually more of what the bulk of an organization, especially a commercial organization, is generating. Think of banks, think of utilities, think of government organisations. This is the type of data that they're spending a lot more of their time on. So with all of that, Joe, why is it so difficult to manage? You pointed out, it's difficult to search, but why is it so difficult to manage our unstructured data? You and I have both now got 50, starting to age us a little bit, 50 plus years in this space. Why is it so difficult to manage?
Yeah, and you're mentioning that it's most of what we generate. There's a bunch of different research on this. It's probably, for most orgs, somewhere around 70 to 90% of the data that we generate, right? And just think about it. Right now, as we record this podcast, we are creating unstructured data in the video. We're creating unstructured data in the audio recording. We're just creating a big lump of unstructured data out there, right? The emails that we send back and forth, the Teams messages that we send back and forth. This is all unstructured data. Very rarely do I see anyone opening up Airtable and creating a structured database when you're just a, normal everyday worker. And to be fair, even things that look like structured, like Excel, it's not. You could put anything you want in Excel, right? You could drop a link with some binary data and put a whole bunch of columns right beside it. There's no order to it, really. What that results in is you try to wrap your mind around all this. Not only is it most of the data that's out there, but it's tons of different formats. And these different formats have their own standards. A PDF document is not a Word document, but we very well could be putting sensitive and regulated information in either of those things. And it's created in just like dozens of tools, if not hundreds of tools. And if you look at some of the large enterprises out there, they're tracking 1,000 plus different SaaS applications and another goodness knows how many like desktop applications. And these all have their own file formats and their own different ways of outputting the information. How many different ways can we create images, right? I could go and open up Photoshop, or I could jump over to Midjourney, or today in the news, everyone's talking about how photorealistic OpenAI's ability to create images are. All of a sudden, bam, I've got some new unstructured data there that I could put whatever I want in there. The other thing that makes unstructured data hard is it doesn't always live in the cloud. Going back to my Salesforce example, like I can pull up the reports and the logs and the audit trails from Salesforce to see what's going on there. I can create a Word document on my desktop that never gets uploaded to anywhere that most enterprises are keeping track of. And so now, the example you could think there is, I could be doing my taxes, right? If I'm doing my taxes, I'm putting my PII in there, I'm putting sensitive financial data on there, and it's on my desktop. It's not being monitored. And so it's just a much larger net and much more opportunity to create, kind of a security, vulnerability, privacy, whatever you want to say, footprint with unstructured data. Just more opportunity in general to do those sorts of things.
And, I think we beat this drum very hard, certainly for me, through the late 90s and early 2000s. One of the different terms I heard, the tsunami of data, the data explosion, the rules of Moore's law, everything doubling every 18 months. 10 years ago, I was using an iPhone that might have had 4 or 16 gig of storage, and now I'm walking around with a terabyte in my pocket, and it's full. And the problem with that is that, I'm obviously now paying for the terabyte data plan. I'm paying for the iCloud plan. I'm going to the next version of iPhone. I have to buy the most expensive one, and I'm hoping that they go to 2 terabytes, which will get even more expensive again, just because I'm creating so much more video. So, taking many more photos of mostly my bulldog, but every now and then my kids as well. But even just when I travel, the way in which we interact now, the simplicity of what we want to be able to do in our day-to-day life. And I use travel as a really good example because I do a lot of it with work. All of my expenses, that coffee I grab in the morning, the train ticket to go out and see the customer, the parking that I'll have at the airport, all of these generate receipts either electronically or in paper form. I then take the photo of them and then I put them into that cloud application, as you said, and I fill in the data. Thankfully, in a lot of cases now, those paper forms can be read by AI and fill in a lot of the work for me. So I'm just taking the photo, but I'm forgetting that that's a 1, 2, 3 megabyte photo that I'm then pushing up and being managed and stored, and has references to where I was and when I was, even just location data, for example, that are all had their own level of risk. But because of the way I work and the way in which I interact, I'm just generating so much more than I ever did before. I remember a time where I carried a manila folder in my backpack for the receipts for that trip so that when I got back to the office, I could then staple them to the expense form and fill it out and sign it just to get my expenses paid, for example. And we should never forget in the unstructured world that paper is included in that. But, we obviously have that piece of we're trying to become more paperless. So those volumes are huge. And I'm interested, do you have any stats there around volumes of data? What's sort of happening there?
I know quite well that 70 to 90% stat. It's the overwhelming amount of data that's being created at this point. And you're mentioning a whole lot about the effort that's gone in and how you've been preaching for years about the tsunami of data. A lot of good tools out there for structured data, for sorting through it, for organizing it, for categorizing it. But right now, it's still a little bit Wild West for most enterprises when it comes to getting a hold of that unstructured data.
Yeah, that leads me to the next question. So we've just said it's difficult to manage. We've just said it's 2/3 to 3/4 to almost all of the actual data that you've got inside an organization. We've talked a little bit about that, it's got benefits to be able to take insight from that information, but what are the risks?
Yeah, risk is an important way to describe unstructured data because there's certainly risk. Oftentimes, I try to fall on the side of how do we add governance to enable business cases, but I think we have to be serious that you can't enable if you don't control your risk. So let's think about the situation we were in a moment ago. We've got a ton of data. Most of our data that we have as an enterprise being created by everyone. So you have very little control over who creates it. You have very little control over where it's stored. You have very little control over what format it's in. And so we've just got this almost apocalyptic scenario of just overload of data that's out there. And that makes it difficult to do things like, you've got to be able to discover what data you have before you can add any sort of privacy or security controls on top of it. If you can't discover it, you're certainly not going to classify it. You're not going to figure out whether you have regulated data inside of it. If you can't classify it, effectively you can't govern it. So how many conversations are going on in the modern corporate world today? I was debriefing with a telecom security professional the other day who was part of a conversation that said, let's go get CMMC certified. And for those who don't know, CMMC, it's the new framework if you want to sell to the U.S. Department of Defense effectively to control classified unsensitive data. So their conversation had a whole bunch of people on there from legal and compliance and security. And it went, all right, we know exactly what the return is, or a good estimate of what the return is if we get CMMC certified. Let's figure out the cost to get CMMC certified. And so everyone's like, all right, let's do that. How do we do that? First, we need to put those controls on that sensitive, unclassified data. And the immediate question from everyone was, okay, what is sensitive, unclassified data? So after a very long conversation where the legal team defined it as strictly as possible, making it as difficult as possible to implement, everyone ended the meeting by saying, super, I have no clue where this data is or how to get a control of it. So here you've got what could be a multi-billion-dollar business case that is blocked because you just have no way to govern your CMMC regulated data. And so, it's another side effect to this, by the way, is when you can't govern your data, is that you hold on to a lot more of it. Like how many folks do we run across that are just hoarding unstructured data just in case? And I think we all know that when you hoard data, you're increasing your overall security footprint and having impacts on that front.
I think that's born of, and I do harp on about this myself, but born of the storage is cheap mentality that we've had for many, many years. But the issue being is that just the sheer volume of what we're doing these days in those different formats that are very, very large, it's not the case anymore. The day of free lunch, as you will, on that storage side is gone. Organizations that we bump into constantly looking at, well, hey, how do we actually save money through all of the storage that we've got here? And again, everyone's afraid to pull the trigger. They don't want to be the one to delete something that they're not sure what it is, but they know they need to save the money that's related to that ever-growing cost that is on the bottom line is just storage.
Yeah. And then as a result, you almost see a backlash to some of these controls that are trying to be put on the different ways of creating unstructured data. In fact, I'm sure everyone's following the news here in the US, but I categorize Signalgate, which is hot off the presses, as the perfect example of how easy it is to expose sensitive information in unstructured formats. I'm sure you've been reading up on this, Kris. Like, we had a Signals chat with the United States Vice President, the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, a bunch of other folks are sitting there discussing sensitive war plans. Very, very regulated information. And you would expect there to be some level of controls in place, but they kind of usurped those controls to go out there and find a way where they could have these conversations, generate this sensitive content without the appropriate governance happening around there.
We've all done it, Joe. Like, I mean, the number of times that you've grabbed a messenger message and gone, da-da-da-da, you're chatting with one person, you're chatting with another person, and then you're like, yeah, the bill's going to be $1.42. And the person's like, what? And you're like, that's for someone else. So, or again, you've probably been in that group where someone's like, I don't think I belong here. You know, interestingly, obviously for me, very early in the piece, got sort of my email, my Gmail address early on, so I've got my name, and for whatever reason, it's a bit of a spam trap. Kris Brown. So I get every Kris Brown on the planet's servicing of their car, the real estate agent chasing them up for this. It's people constantly forget their little bit of extra. So I end up on all sorts of chats. My current one, I'm regularly a part of chat for a running club in Jamaica. Things that I will definitely not be doing, running and probably visiting Jamaica anytime soon. Unfortunately, I would love to, and so it's really, we've seen these things, right? It's very easy to happen. You'd think they'd be a little bit more sensitive almost to the fact that they're talking about sensitive topics. They're deliberately gone there, because they could. Why are they able to do that? Well, they're humans, they've got phones, they're connected to the internet. The other humans have got phones, they're connected. They introduced the reporter, and today wasn't going to be so newsy, but it's just a great example, as you said, on how easy it is for that stuff to slip through and create the noise that it has.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there, right? Humans are the reason unstructured data is difficult to manage. And like, if we summarize everything we've said, it's humans, it's us.
And look, I think, to hit on that too, though, we do talk about regulation and legislation here quite a lot as it relates to the information management world. The other risks here are penalties, fines, a good old-fashioned slap on the wrist, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. Ultimately, there's a lot of risk there just in that space. You start to look at globally, there are a ton of regulations. Every country, every jurisdiction has some form of Public Records Act for the government side. We're seeing growing privacy legislation here as well across the globe. At some count, it was like 161 nations have some form of federal or growing federal legislation. Obviously, in the States, there's an awful lot of state-based legislation that's growing. Those risks are also there because it is targeting that data. This is where that information lives. As you say, in the structured systems, it's probably relatively easy to understand that the field called name has names in it. The field called date of birth has date of births in it. And if you don't want to hang on to it, you know where to go looking for it. It's very easy. In a recent study that we did here at RecordPoint, we had a bunch of our customers run a trial on the privacy product, and we found that just 1% of all of the stuff that ran through the platform in any given month had PCI, so credit card information in it. Doesn't sound like a lot. Platform does hundreds of millions of objects on a regular basis. 1% of those for just one customer was 20 and 30,000 credit card numbers living in unstructured data from SharePoint, from file shares, from Teams, from interactions with customers who trust the entity that they're dealing with. And so all of a sudden that trust is betrayed because it's sitting in places where everybody has access to it. Now, there was probably no intent from anybody in those organizations to do anything bad. But the issue is that if I was to scrape an entire SharePoint environment, my expectation now would be that 1% of it has credit card information in it. So if I'm a bad actor, that risk exists there. And I tend to feel that from a security perspective, this is more of a when than an if situation. And when are you going to get breached as opposed to if you are going to get breached?
Yeah, and your SharePoint example, so I'm in Seattle. We have big Boeing presence here. I mean, was it just a year and a half ago? Somebody was scraping a SharePoint site from Boeing. And from there, they pulled employee PII, they pulled defense projects, they pulled compliance reports on export rules. When they underwent their audit on what you should have done better, it was, hey, you should actually classify this stuff correctly. So know what you have in there, and you need to put access controls on it. It's not always unintentional folks doing this either. I mean, there's examples from AT&T, T-Mobile, Capital One, Wells Fargo, just like call center employees stealing the data from their customers, financial information, social security or national IDs from them, and then in some cases, literally selling it to the mafia. And so you've got to stay on top of these things, right?
So let's pivot a little bit. Wouldn't be a File podcast if we didn't say the magic words AI or artificial intelligence. So let's go to the AI hook. Generative AI loves unstructured data. This is what our chat GPTs and all of the other ones, the Geminis, etc., are all driving. And training an LLM on a particular data set's a great way to turn a volume of files into insights. So I think we're both big believers of that. So should everybody be doing this? The irony here is we need to ensure that we've got solid AI governance in place. So the tools most suited for understanding the unstructured data aren't being trained on that sensitive and confidential stuff. I'm sort of working with Microsoft at the moment around a number of Copilot pieces. And I think you recently, Joe, did a session where you were talking about a number of Copilot or other AI LLM implementations are being blocked on the back of that worry of releasing sensitive, confidential information. So talk to us a little bit about that and how unstructured data is linked to AI and LLMs.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. AI is the hot topic of the day. They should give you a soundboard and you have a crazy noise like the morning shock jocks every time you say AI.
And let me pivot there because that'd be fun. Maybe that can be the Christmas party edition that we roll through the highlights, and every time Kris says AI or do that, for the producers, the edit. How many different ways can Kris say AI? But I listened to a session from someone yesterday, and they were saying AI today is like Amazon sort of 30 years ago. It's like everybody's like, what do you mean someone's going to sell books online and that's going to be bigger than Walmart, bigger than some of these other organizations? And people really sort of couldn't quite grasp that what it really is going to be truly possible to do with these. And interestingly, Jeff Bezos, whether you like him or hate him, had a bit of a vision there. It was less about the books and it was more about how to work out where in the country of obviously the United States you should be putting warehouses, because books are all roughly the same size. Shipping a book from one place to another is a finite problem, and being able to work out what's the quickest and best way to create warehouses across those locations, that data that he created, that first few years around that's what Amazon was all about, was building out the infrastructure, the AWS that came from it, the cloud infrastructure. He rode that wave off the back of studying the books. And so the interesting correlation I'm trying to make here was, what we think AI is possible and what it's capable of is almost looking at what do we think Amazon was capable of 20-something years ago. We're not really sure what the underlying things that this is going to be capable of. It is going to be huge for us over the next 20, 30 years. And so, we do harp on it a little bit about it here on File, but it's really, really interesting. I found that a really, really poignant piece. But we've still got that problem of it relies on unstructured data. We just said unstructured data has a bunch of risk. It's huge volume. What does that mean for the listener, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 trillion problem to solve, right? Every company wants to put AI into their organization. Even if right now folks are thinking super low level, just roll out ChatGPT and Copilot into their organizations. But, if they want to roll this out they want to do it mostly with unstructured data. They want to look through their meeting notes and their emails to help them make better decisions. Like that was the whole basis for Mills Chat, which General Mills has now rolled out to pretty much everywhere in the world. Like how many, almost 100 countries they pushed it out to. We keep running across situations where architecture documents, they want to use them to make better railroad engineering or bridge engineering decisions. But to do these things, like you got to be able to enable that unstructured data. One thing that we know for some market research that we've done at RecordPoint is somewhere around 80 to 90% of those companies that want to use AI, which is effectively everyone, they're frozen. Like they can't do anything. And the reason they're frozen is because they don't have data governance in place and they don't have security governance in place. And so what's happening is organization after organization is rolling out what I heard nicely termed the other day, the AI firewall, which is basically a policy that says, do not use ChatGPT to do your job today. We also know from research that effectively everyone's ignoring that. They're just firing up their personal ChatGPT account. I saw some data from Cyberhaven the other day. Somewhere around 75 to 90% of ChatGPT, Copilot, and Gemini use in the workplace right now is on the personal account. And I guarantee you, barely anyone has gone in there and checked that little flag that says, please do not train on my data. So now we're leaking tons of sensitive data out there. And we have numbers around this. Again, from Cyberhaven, I've been following their work closely. But around 23% of all queries that go out into personal ChatGPT accounts, for example, have sensitive, confidential, or regulated data in them. I think this is realistically the largest leak of sensitive data in human history because everyone is just going out there and pushing their sensitive data out there, whether it's source code or, it's guaranteed to be PII, and you probably see all kinds of other stuff out there. But in the meantime, it's these fears and these worries is why, you're talking about Microsoft. I think it's around 3 to 4% of folks that are trialing Copilot in the enterprise have gotten out of the pilot phase. Everyone else is just stuck trying to enable it because step 1, I turn on Copilot. Step 2, I want to put data in there. Step 3, everyone freaks out because now you're going to put my sensitive IP and things like that onto an AI. There's a reason why industry organizations like the IAPP have listed this as literally the number one problem that we have to solve for the year 2025. I think we all know as the magic of AI wears off and we start to get down to the reality of doing business with it, that this isn't going to be solved this year. It's going to take us many years to mature this, where we can actually start to get those business cases of saving bunches of money and making bunches of money off of our AI business plans.
And look, I think like anything, legislation, regulation is going to be slow to follow. It isn't going to move as quickly as the market does. So we can't wait for those things to come along and tell us vendors, us customers, us organizations who have got lots of data. We can't wait for them to tell us what should be done. So let's play the advice game. Joe's got the crystal ball. What can be done? You need the right tools and the right data governance in place, but what can be done?
We talked about a lot of this. Step one is adding the governance on your data, but let me step up kind of a level higher than that. There are frameworks out there that are in place to recommend how to get control of your AI. And they kind of break into 3 areas. I'm going to summarize what's literally hundreds of controls down into 3 areas. The first one is know what AIs you're using. So you probably know that you're doing a trial of Copilot, for example, in your enterprise. But I was chatting with some Gartner analysts the other day, and they pointed out in the next 2 to 3 years, 90% plus of your enterprise SaaS apps are going to have some form of AI built into them. And so whether you think you're using AI or not today, you're using AI. So knowing what AIs you're using, the second step is know what your AIs are doing. So you actually have to look into it, whether it's custom models that you're building internally or the external tools. We receive these inquiries quite often now on how are you using our data? How is it being trained? Or are you training on the data within your systems? But this is also going to introduce some new concepts to a lot of enterprises, like the concept of bias and fairness on knowing what your AI does. And these are very specific terms often to industries. Once you know which AIs you're using and you know what your AI is doing, then we get into the exciting world of knowing what data is feeding into your AIs. And this is actually the hardest part. Like, I can do an inventory of AIs across any size organization. I can pull these SaaS systems that are being used within an enterprise. Like, this is a finite amount of information to collect. Getting the data that's in there, that's much more difficult because you want to apply those privacy controls. You want to apply those security controls down to the user level. And you want to do it against your unstructured data. If I was an enterprise tackling this, I would tackle that hard problem first, because that's where the inevitable leaks from the quote unquote shadow AI are happening. Get governance over your unstructured data, and then you can feed it out into your various different AI systems. What does getting governance mean? Just kind of summarize at a high level. Get all your data into one view so you know everything you have. Go through the time of classifying your data. Is this a legal document? Is this an HR document? I mean, there's various different ways you can classify it, but know what type of data it is. And then get into the tricky business of knowing if you have sensitive data in there. We're talking about, you detected all those credit cards for that one customer. Know where you have credit card data out there. And then afterwards, once you have data governance in place, you can implement your retention, your data lifecycle management, your controls to minimize your security footprints. That's basic data governance. And then you can extend that to, hey, we know what's inside of our data. We know what data we don't want to go into AIs. We know who we don't want to have access to that data. Magic. You kind of now have a concept of AI governance out there. I mean, that's basically what they're telling you to do. Whether it's the EU AI Act, there's some folks who are working with the OECD to put together frameworks. A whole bunch of national governments are trying to regulate this. I personally am a big fan of the NIST AI RMF. I think that's the most holistic structure that's out there. But even if you don't want to get down into the details of learning a new framework and possibly even doing internal and external audits against a new framework, if you just try to take your privacy controls today, your GDPRs, your CCPAs, and your security controls, your PCIs, your CMMCs, or whatever frameworks you're using to comply with, if you take those and just extend them into your AI environments, once you have control of your data there, you know what AIs you have and you know what they're doing, you're more advanced than 99% of folks out there. Just do what you're already good at and extend it out into this new AI environment.
I think it's all great advice. And interestingly for me, from listeners and certainly information governance professionals, for the last 20-something years, we've sort of been saying the same thing. Get your data under control. There's plenty of value there. We've started to look at the storage problem and how you can get a bunch of cost savings around storage by doing good data minimization, help with regulation around classification, and just straight out data governance, as you've said. We now have a genuine new use case, which is if you've got all those things, you've done the right thing, you can actually take more advantage of AI than anyone else. And this is going to become a competitive advantage. So if you are that records manager, you are that information governance professional, if you are advising organizations around security or AI, and you're not saying to them, get a good handle on everything that you've got in the business, this will lead to faster implementation. It will lead to value more quickly. This is a massive use case for this industry that has not been there previously. Getting unstructured data under control should be one of the top priorities for any information governance professional, especially in the era of AI. Joe, thanks for joining me today on behalf of Anthony Woodward and myself, Kris Brown. Looking forward to hearing from you all and your comments as we trip around. It's conference season. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Filed.